The night of betrayal. The rain poured heavily, soaking the earth in a relentless downpour. Thunder rumbled in the distance, shaking the air with its mighty roar. The Dawson mansion stood tall and grand, its golden lights glowing warmly in contrast to the chaos unfolding inside. "Please, Richard, don't do this." Margaret Dawson's voice cracked as she clung to the doorframe, desperation in her eyes. Her once neat brown hair was disheveled, and her nightgown was already damp from the rain. Richard Dawson stood in the doorway, his face twisted in cruel amusement. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, dressed in an expensive silk robe, his short, dark hair slicked back. He looked down at Margaret as if she were a stray dog begging for scraps. "I should have done this the day my brother died," Richard sneered. His voice was cold, void of any remorse. "This house belongs to me now. You and your brat have no place here." Margaret turned to her daughter, Emma, who stood a few steps behind her. The 13-year-old girl had her small arms wrapped around herself, shivering. Her long dark hair clung to her pale face, her brown eyes wide with fear. "Uncle Richard, please," Emma's voice wavered. "This is our home." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "Not anymore." He snapped his fingers, and two security guards stepped forward, grabbing Margaret by the arms. She let out a sharp gasp, struggling against their iron grip. "Richard, please. We have nowhere to go," she cried. Richard leaned in, lowering his voice. "That's not my problem, Margaret. You should have been smarter, should have known your place. Now get out." With a flick of his wrist, the guards shoved Margaret and Emma out onto the porch. The rain hit them like icy needles, instantly soaking their thin clothes. Margaret stumbled, barely managing to stay on her feet. Emma rushed to her side, wrapping her arms around her mother's waist. "Mom!" Before she could say another word, the heavy mansion doors slammed shut with a loud bang. The sound echoed through the night, final and absolute. Margaret took a shaky breath, staring at the massive doors that had once welcomed her as a beloved wife. Now, they were nothing more than a wall between her and the life she had lost. Emma's small fingers gripped her mother's hand tightly. "Mom, what do we do now?" Margaret blinked rapidly, forcing herself to hold back her tears. She had to stay strong for her daughter. "We walk," she whispered. "We'll find somewhere safe." Emma's lips trembled, but she nodded. The cold wind howled around them as they stepped off the porch, their bare feet sinking into the muddy ground. The street was eerily empty. The rain made it impossible to see far ahead, the streetlights flickering in the distance. They walked for what felt like hours. The cold seeped into their bones, their thin clothes clinging to their soaked skin. Margaret's hands had gone numb, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Then, Emma stumbled. "Emma!" Margaret caught her just before she hit the ground. I'm so cold," the girl murmured, her teeth chattering. Margaret scanned their surroundings desperately. The city was quiet at this hour, the stores and homes locked up, their windows dark. They had no money, no shelter, no one to turn to. Her heart clenched in helplessness. Then, she spotted something, a small bridge just a few meters ahead. It wasn't much, but at least it would provide some cover from the relentless rain. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered, pulling Emma along. They huddled together beneath the bridge, their bodies pressed against the cold stone wall. Margaret pulled Emma onto her lap, wrapping her arms around her daughter to share whatever warmth she could. "Mom," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why did Uncle Richard do this to us?" Margaret hesitated. How could she explain betrayal to a child? How could she make her daughter understand that greed and cruelty could exist in family? "I don't know, baby," she finally said, pressing a kiss to Emma's damp forehead. "But I promise you, we'll get through this." Emma didn't respond. She simply curled up against her mother, her small body shivering uncontrollably. Margaret bit her lip, staring up at the rain-soaked world above them. This wasn't how their life was supposed to be. Just when Margaret was about to lose all hope, the sound of footsteps echoed under the bridge. She tensed, her grip tightening around Emma. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, his face partially obscured by the dim glow of a nearby streetlight. He was dressed in a dark coat, his hands tucked into his pockets. His blue eyes scanned them with concern. "Are you two all right?" His voice was deep, gentle. Margaret hesitated. The last time she trusted someone, she ended up on the streets. But what choice did she have now? We were thrown out of our home," she admitted, her voice shaking. "We have nowhere to go." The man crouched down to their level, his brows furrowing. "You've been out in this rain for a while, haven't you?" Margaret simply nodded. The man's gaze softened. He pulled off his coat and draped it over Margaret and Emma. "Come with me," he said. "I'll get you somewhere warm." Margaret hesitated. Why would you help us?" The man offered a small, reassuring smile. "Because no one deserves to be left in the cold." Margaret looked at Emma, whose eyes fluttered open at the warmth of the coat. She was so exhausted, so weak. If they stayed here any longer, she might not make it through the night. With a deep breath, Margaret nodded. "All right." The man stood and helped them to their feet. "My name is James Carter," he introduced himself. "And you're safe now." Margaret clutched Emma close as they followed James into the night, stepping away from the bridge that had almost become their grave. For the first time since the nightmare began, Margaret allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, they still had a chance. The struggles, hard life on the streets. Margaret falls sick due to stress and malnutrition. Emma takes odd jobs, sometimes begging for food. One day, a woman named Sarah Green, a philanthropist, notices Emma's intelligence and determination. Sarah takes them in and sponsors Emma's education abroad. The sound of the airplane's engines hummed softly as Emma Dawson stared out the window, watching the clouds pass below her. She still couldn't believe it. Just a few months ago, she was sleeping on the cold streets, begging for food, and struggling to keep her mother alive. Now, she was on a plane to London, heading toward a future she never imagined possible. Sarah Green sat beside her, glancing over with a warm smile. "Are you excited, Emma?" Emma turned to her, gripping her seat's armrest tightly. "A little, and scared." Sarah chuckled. "That's normal. But trust me, you're about to start a new life. One that will change everything." Emma swallowed hard and nodded. She had promised herself she would make the most of this opportunity. And she would. Arriving in London felt like stepping into another universe. The tall skyscrapers, the bustling streets, the people dressed in expensive suits, it was overwhelming. Emma and Margaret were taken to a beautiful apartment Sarah had arranged for them. It was nothing like the tiny, damp room they had lived in back home. "Mom, look at this place," Emma whispered in awe as they walked inside. The living room was modern, with soft couches, a huge TV, and a kitchen filled with food. Margaret, who had regained some strength after receiving proper medical care, touched Emma's face gently. "We're safe now, baby." Tears filled Emma's eyes. Safe. Something they hadn't been in a long time. But she knew this was just the beginning. Emma started school at one of the best private institutions in London. At first, she felt out of place. Most of the students came from rich families, wore designer clothes, and had everything handed to them. But she wasn't there to fit in. She was there to learn and grow. She buried herself in books, studying business, finance, and technology. She spent hours in the library, reading about successful entrepreneurs. One day, during lunch, she overheard a conversation between two classmates. "I made £500 last night selling sneakers online," one of them bragged. Emma's eyes widened. "Wait, people sell things online and make money?" The boy laughed. "Of course. There's a whole business behind it. You just have to be smart." That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She grabbed her laptop and started researching. E-commerce, digital marketing, online businesses. And just like that, a fire ignited inside her. At 16, Emma took her first risk. She used a small grant Sarah's foundation gave her for school projects and invested in building a website. She called it Dawson Tech. Her idea was simple: create affordable but high-quality gadgets and accessories for young people. She designed wireless earphones, smartwatches, and phone cases, outsourcing production from affordable manufacturers. With no money for marketing, she used social media, creating viral posts, sending products to influencers, and using every free strategy she could find. At first, nothing happened. She waited and waited. Then, one day, an order came in. Then another. And another. Within a year, Dawson Tech exploded. Her website crashed from too many visitors. Orders poured in from all over the world. Investors started noticing. By 17, she was running a multi-million-pound company. One afternoon, Margaret walked into Emma's room and froze. Boxes of gadgets filled the space, her laptop had dozens of tabs open, and Emma was on the phone, speaking confidently. "Yes, tell the suppliers we need the new batch by next week. No delays. Thank you." As she hung up, Margaret sat beside her. "Emma, are you running a company?" Emma hesitated, then smiled. "Yes, Mom." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. How did this happen?" Emma took her mother's hands. "Because of you. You never gave up, Mom. And I won't either." Margaret pulled her into a hug, whispering, "I'm so proud of you." By the time she turned 18, Emma Dawson was no longer just a girl who had once begged for food. She was a billionaire. Dawson Tech had expanded worldwide. She owned multiple businesses, a clothing line, a real estate company, and even an airline. One day, during an international interview, the host smiled at her and asked, "Emma, how does it feel to be the youngest self-made billionaire?" Emma took a deep breath, looking straight into the camera. "It feels like a reminder that no matter how dark life gets, you can always rise again." And the world watched in awe as the girl who was once homeless became a legend. Emma now had more money, power, and influence than her Uncle Richard could ever imagine. And now, it was time to return home. Because she wasn't the helpless little girl anymore. She was Emma Dawson, the billionaire. And she was coming back. The sun cast a golden glow over the small town as the private jet descended onto the local airstrip. It was the first time anyone had ever seen a jet land there. A red carpet stretched from the plane's stairs to a fleet of black SUVs waiting on the runway. Inside the jet, Emma Dawson sat in a luxurious seat, dressed in a breathtaking designer gown, her heels tapping lightly against the floor. She was no longer the helpless girl her uncle had thrown out. As the doors opened, the entire town held its breath. People had gathered near the airport, whispering, eyes wide with disbelief. "That can't be Emma Dawson," one woman gasped. "But she left with nothing. How is she back like this?" another muttered. Emma descended the stairs gracefully, her chin lifted high. Every step she took sent a powerful message. The girl who had once begged for food was now walking like a queen returning to claim her throne. She reached the black Rolls-Royce waiting for her. The driver opened the door, but before stepping inside, she turned, taking in the town that had once turned its back on her. She had come home. And this time, she was in control. As the convoy drove through the familiar streets, Emma noticed how much had changed. The once thriving town looked broken. Shops were closed. Buildings were crumbling. The streets looked emptier than she remembered. Then, she saw it, the house. The very house where her uncle had thrown her and her mother out in the middle of the night. But it was no longer the grand mansion it once was. The paint had peeled off, the windows were cracked, and the gates hung loosely on rusty hinges. It looked abandoned. Emma's lips curled into a small smile. So, he finally lost everything. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement. People gathered around, whispering louder now. "That's Richard's house, or at least, what's left of it. She's really back. And look at her, so powerful." The past had reversed itself. Once, she had stood in these same streets, desperate, hungry, and weak. Now, she was the most powerful person in town. And she had come for closure. From inside the house, Richard Dawson watched nervously through a broken window. He knew she would come back one day. But he never expected her to come back like this, richer, stronger, untouchable. His hands trembled as he stepped outside, his once proud posture now hunched with defeat. He had nothing left. His business had collapsed, his wife had left him, and his so-called friends had abandoned him when his money ran out. Now, standing before him was the niece he had betrayed. "Emma," he croaked, stepping forward. Emma crossed her arms, staring at him with cold amusement. "Richard." He fell to his knees. "Please, forgive me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The same man who had once kicked her out was now kneeling before her. Emma raised an eyebrow. "Forgive you? You had no mercy when you threw me and my mother onto the streets." Tears streamed down Richard's face. "I was a fool. I was blinded by greed. But look at me now, I've lost everything. I have nothing left." Emma's expression didn't change. "And you think that's enough punishment?" Richard sobbed. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please, help me. I'm your uncle, after all." Emma laughed softly, shaking her head. "No, Richard. You stopped being my family the moment you threw me out." Then, a dark secret slipped from his lips. "Emma, there's something I must tell you," he whispered. "Your father, he didn't die of natural causes." Emma's breath caught. "What?" Richard swallowed hard. "I poisoned him." The world seemed to stop. The crowd gasped. Margaret, standing behind Emma, let out a small cry. Emma's entire body went cold. "You killed my father." Richard nodded, tears falling onto the dusty ground. "I wanted his wealth. I thought if he was gone, I would control everything." Emma's hands curled into fists. She had spent years believing her father's death was a tragedy. Now, she learned it was murder. She could destroy Richard right here, right now. She could call the police, let him rot in prison. But then, she remembered something her mother once told her. Revenge doesn't heal wounds. Only justice and peace do. She took a deep breath. She had a better plan. Emma turned to her assistant. "Buy this house." The assistant nodded and immediately made a call. Richard's eyes widened. "You're buying the house?" Emma smirked. "Yes. But not for you." She faced the crowd. "From today, this house will no longer be a place of greed and cruelty." She turned back to Richard. "I'm turning it into a shelter for homeless women and children." Gasps filled the air. Richard's jaw dropped. What? Emma's voice was steady. "Women like my mother. Children like me. This house will be a place of safety, not suffering." Margaret wiped away tears of pride. "Oh, Emma, your father would be so proud of you." Richard broke down, sobbing. "I have nowhere to go. No money. No family. What will happen to me?" Emma stared at him. Once, she had been in this same position, alone, desperate, abandoned. But she wouldn't make the same mistakes he did. She sighed. "I forgive you, Richard. But I will never help you." Richard's shoulders shook as the truth settled in. Emma Dawson was not his enemy. She was simply above him now. And as she walked away, the town erupted in cheers. The beggar girl had returned as a billionaire. And her past. She had turned it into power. As Emma stepped back into her Rolls-Royce, Margaret squeezed her hand. "You did the right thing, sweetheart." Emma smiled softly. "I know, Mom. And now, it's time for new beginnings." The car pulled away, leaving behind a town that would never forget the name Emma Dawson. And as Richard sat alone on the ground, he realized. He had created his own downfall. And the little girl he had once abandoned had risen higher than he could ever dream. The night air was crisp as Emma Dawson stepped onto the balcony of her luxurious penthouse, overlooking the city skyline. The world she had once struggled in was now at her feet. She had everything, wealth, power, success. But tonight, something felt different. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "You still love the night air, don't you?" She turned, a smile forming as she met James Carter's warm gaze. James, the man who had once given her and her mother shelter when they had nowhere to go. The man who had believed in her before anyone else. And now, he was standing in her home, looking at her the same way he always had, with admiration and something deeper, something unspoken. James leaned against the railing, his sharp suit fitting him perfectly. The young businessman had built his own empire, rising from humble beginnings just like Emma. "You've come a long way, Emma," he said softly, his voice filled with pride. Emma let out a small chuckle. "And you?" "I heard Carter Enterprises is now one of the most successful companies in the country." James shrugged. "Success isn't about money. It's about impact." Emma's lips curled into a smile. "That sounds exactly like something you'd say." James studied her, his dark eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. "I always knew you'd make it." Emma tilted her head. "Oh, and how did you know that?" He grinned. "Because even back then, when life had beaten you down, you still held your head high. You never let the world break you." Her heart skipped a beat. She had spent years proving herself, building an empire, reclaiming what was stolen. But somehow, he had seen her strength even when she was at her weakest. And that meant something. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, just two souls who had survived life's worst storms. Finally, James turned to her, his expression more serious. "Emma, can I ask you something?" She raised an eyebrow. "You just did." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Okay, let me ask another." Emma nodded, curious. "With everything you've accomplished, are you happy?" The question caught her off guard. She had spent so much time chasing success, chasing closure, proving to the world that she was unstoppable. But had she ever stopped to ask herself if she was truly happy? Emma looked down at the sparkling city lights below. "I should be," she admitted. "I have everything I ever wanted. But sometimes, it feels like something is missing." James didn't say anything right away. He just watched her, understanding in his eyes. Then, in a voice so soft she almost didn't hear it, he said, "Maybe you're missing someone to share it with." Emma's breath hitched. She turned to him, their eyes locking. And in that moment, everything changed. Because for the first time in years, she saw James not just as the man who had helped her, not just as a friend, but as something more. Something she had been too blind to see before. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Emma, I need to tell you something." She nodded, her pulse quickening. "Go on." He hesitated, then let out a deep breath. "I've loved you for years." Emma's heart stopped. James continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "From the moment I found you and your mother in that storm, something inside me told me you were special. And every time I saw you fight, every time I saw you rise, that feeling only grew stronger." Emma's hands trembled slightly. She had never expected this. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" she whispered. James chuckled dryly. "Because you had bigger things to fight for. I didn't want to be another thing you had to figure out." Tears pricked at the edges of Emma's eyes. She had spent so many years proving her worth to the world, never realizing there had been someone all along who had seen it, who had loved her through every battle. "James," she whispered, stepping closer. For the first time in a long time, her walls started to crumble. And then, he reached for her hand. "Emma, I don't want to be another powerful man in your life. I don't want to be another deal, another success story. I just want to be the man who makes you smile when the world feels heavy." Emma inhaled sharply. Because for the first time in years, she wanted something that wasn't about revenge or power. She wanted him. Emma laughed softly, shaking her head. "You know, James, I think I've always loved you too. I was just too stubborn to see it." James smirked. "That does sound like you." She rolled her eyes playfully before stepping closer, her heart racing. "So what now?" James squeezed her hand. "Now, we take it one step at a time. Together." Emma nodded. For once, she wasn't planning her next business move or her next battle. For once, she was just a woman standing in front of a man who had always been there. And as James leaned in, his lips brushing softly against hers, Emma finally understood. Kindness always returns. And sometimes, it brings love with it. As they stood on the balcony, wrapped in each other's warmth, the city lights continued to glow below them. Emma had conquered her past. But with James, she was ready to embrace her future. Together. The grand auditorium was packed with thousands of people. Business leaders, students, parents, and journalists. The event was being broadcast live worldwide. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation as everyone waited for the woman who had become a global sensation. Emma Dawson. Her name was no longer just a name. It was a symbol of resilience, power, and kindness. As she stepped onto the massive stage, a thunderous applause erupted. She wore a simple yet elegant white dress, her long hair cascading down her back. She didn't need extravagance to prove her worth anymore. She had already won. Standing before the microphone, she took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the thousands of faces before her. Some were children who had been where she once was, hungry, hopeless, abandoned. Tonight, she was here for them. She smiled warmly. 5 years ago, I had nothing. I was just a girl thrown out into the streets with my mother. I had no food, no shelter, and no future. The crowd fell silent. Emma continued, her voice steady but emotional. There were nights when I went to sleep hungry. There were days I begged for food. I know what it means to feel invisible, to feel like the world has turned its back on you. She paused, her gaze locking onto a young girl sitting in the front row, her eyes wide with admiration. Emma saw herself in that girl. But someone saw me, Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. A stranger showed me kindness when I least expected it. And because of that kindness, I got the chance to build a life I never dreamed possible. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. And today, she continued, I want to return that kindness. Emma turned slightly to the large screen behind her. The screen lit up, showing a list of names, hundreds of them. These, Emma gestured toward the screen, are the names of children who will be receiving full scholarships to some of the best schools in the world. A collective gasp filled the auditorium. She smiled as tears filled the eyes of parents in the audience. These scholarships will cover everything, tuition, books, housing, and even personal mentorship, Emma said, her voice filled with passion. Because I know that education is the one thing no one can take away from you. It is the key to breaking the cycle of poverty. The applause that followed was deafening. Some children burst into tears, clutching their parents. The impact of Emma's gift was more than just financial, it was hope. As the cheers quieted down, Emma took another deep breath. She knew what people expected. They wanted her to talk about Richard. About revenge. But that was not the woman she had become. People ask me all the time, she said, if I ever wanted revenge on the man who hurt me and my mother. The room went still. She let the silence stretch for a moment before answering. No, she said simply. Whispers spread through the crowd. Some seemed shocked by her answer. Emma smiled softly. Revenge does not heal wounds. It does not erase the past. It does not bring peace. She looked out at the audience, her eyes shining. I chose to build, not destroy. A standing ovation erupted. People rose to their feet, clapping, crying, cheering. Because this was not just a speech, it was a lesson. Emma had every reason to seek revenge, to make Richard suffer the way he had made her suffer. But instead, she had turned pain into purpose. And that was true victory. As the applause died down, Emma's expression grew serious again. She stepped closer to the microphone and spoke directly to the young boys and girls in the audience. If you are struggling right now, if you feel invisible, if you feel like the world has turned its back on you, I want you to hear me. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. You matter. A few sniffles were heard from the crowd. You are more than your circumstances. You are more than the pain you have endured. And no matter what anyone tells you, you are worthy of love, success, and happiness. Tears streamed down the faces of many. And if no one has told you this before, let me be the first. I believe in you. The entire room erupted in applause again. Emma felt a lump in her throat. This was why she had fought so hard. Not for money. Not for power. But to make sure that no other child would feel as lost as she once did. As the applause continued, Emma turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting James Carter's in the front row. He was watching her with a proud smile, his eyes filled with admiration. Their story had started with kindness. And now, it had come full circle. James mouthed, "I'm proud of you." Emma felt warmth spread through her chest. She smiled softly, nodding in appreciation. This was only the beginning. As she stepped down from the stage, Emma knew that she had done what she came to do. She had proven that kindness is more powerful than cruelty. That forgiveness is stronger than hatred. And that victory is not about destroying your enemies, it's about lifting others up. She had won. And she had done it without vengeance. The world would remember her not as the girl who was abandoned, but as the woman who rose above it all. Emma Dawson. A name that would inspire generations. The end. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to get more interesting stories like this.